Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Apologetics from the Attic. Dave Lewis here with you. How's everyone doing today? So you may have seen on the channel I did a response to Provisionist Perspective on certain anti-Calvinist proof texts, non-Calvinist proof texts that show supposedly that determinism is not compatible with the text that they cited. And we went over that. And that made me just think that I need to do an episode where we actually look at the biblical text and look at what does the Bible teach about these matters. And the way we're going to do it is we're just going to walk through some biblical texts and let's try to filter out of our thinking any of these philosophical categories, compatibilism, determinism, libertarianism, anything like that. And let's just look at the face of the text and see what it says. Now, I have to give credit. I'm looking at this book right here. Whomever He Wills, A Surprising Display of Sovereign Mercy. Edited by Matthew Barrett, Thomas J. Nettles. This thing is way back from 2012, Founders Press. And this was put out as a response, I believe, to a book put out by the traditionalists and the Southern Baptists, which was called Whosoever Wills, I think. And then they made their response, Whomever He Wills. But there's an article in here by Bruce Ware. And I found it to be an excellent layout of what we're about to go over. It's The Compatibility of Determinism and Human Freedom, Chapter 7. By Bruce Ware. So what I want to do is, let's go over here. And I got my whiteboard out, and we're going to look at 6 different texts. And we're just going to look at them, and we're going to ask the question, what do these texts teach? What does the Bible put out there as when an event happens in time, when something comes to pass, when it comes to human decisions being made? And God's involvement in those human decisions. What does the Bible teach about that? That's just all we're going to say. And let's just try to get a sense of this. So the first text we want to look at is Genesis 3:21 and 22. And this one is, no, it's not 3. I wrote that down wrong. Exodus 3:21 and 22. So let's pull this text up. Exodus 3:21. So this is where God has called Moses at the burning bush to go in and declare to Pharaoh to let his people go. And this is something God says to Moses. Exodus 3:21. God is speaking to Moses here. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So, and this actually happens. After the final plague and the Israelites are leaving Egypt, they ask their neighbors for gold and silver jewelry and clothing, and they give it to them. Now, in this text, what we see here is 2 things. God is doing something here. What is God doing? God is saying, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Okay, so what's God going to do? God is going to do something in the heart of the Egyptian people that when the Israelites ask them for gold and silver jewelry, they're going to give it to them. So, And let's read Ware on this, because he has this. Where is it at? Okay, and we're going to turn the book cam on so you can look at it if you want to follow along while I'm reading it. But he's got an interesting It's got an interesting way that he frames this that I really think is helpful. So here's what Ware says about this text. Well, let's just read the whole thing, just because it's and he basically does the same thing with all these texts. First, early in the book of Exodus, we learned some of God's plans for how he would deliver his people of Israel from Egypt. Among the many ways God worked to make this happen is this remarkable detail. God said to Moses, "And I will give this people, Israel, favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and when you go, you shall not go empty." Okay, we read that text. It appears then that God was able to determine something to happen that required for its fulfillment people acting freely and doing what they most wanted to do. This event is not merely accounted for by appeal to God's foreknowledge. So that's important, right? So God is determining that when the people of Israel leave Egypt, this will happen. These Egyptians will give them gold and silver jewelry. So God is determining this to happen, but its fulfillment requires the Egyptians to want to give them this gold and jewelry. That is, and it's not, God doesn't just say, well, I see this is going to happen. God is taking an action. I will give this people favor. That is, God does not tell Moses merely that he knows before Israel leaves, when the Israelite women ask their Egyptian neighbors for their gold, silver, and clothing, that they will give these items to the Israelites. No, there is more than merely this. God tells Moses, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, indicating that God causes something to happen within the Egyptians that leads them to make the choice to give of their wealth to the Israelites before they leave. So it is not that God merely foreknows what the Egyptians will do, but God determines, I will give this people favor, what the Egyptians will do. And yet, there is every reason to think that when the Egyptians give the Israelites of their wealth, as God has determined that they do, that the Egyptians did so freely. That is, they did exactly what they most wanted to do, while they also carried out what God determined that they do. It is apparent, then, that we have a case here of the compatibility of divine determinism and human freedom. So in this simple biblical story, we have this. And then I like how he frames it here. Allow me to press the point just a bit further. If you ask the question, why did the Israelites leave Egypt with silver, gold, and fine clothing from the Egyptians? You have to give two, not one answer to be complete. So let me go back to the whiteboard. I think this is a very, very important point. And I've said this before. A lot of having a balanced biblical theology is having the ability to say two things, not just one thing. The imbalance in the incomplete understanding of the biblical text and biblical theology as a whole is when someone can only say one thing about a topic, and really it's two things. So let's go here. What are the two? So and this is going to apply to all these texts. There's two things that we have to say. Why? The question is, why does something happen? Okay, why did the Egyptians give of their gold and jewelry to the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt when they asked of it? Let's see what Ware says. You have to give two answers. It will not do merely to say the Egyptian women chose to give the Israelite women of their wealth. Okay, so back to the whiteboard. So the first answer, why? Well, the Egyptians, right, chose to give. Okay, yeah, that would be an answer of why that event in history happened, that the Egyptians chose to give the Israelites of their gold and silver and their clothing. However, you couldn't, so God, what's the other reason why that happened? God caused the Egyptian women to look with favor on the Israelite women so that when they asked the Egyptian women to give of their wealth. Here's the point. Both answers are true, but each is a partial truth. You have to give both answers together for the full accounting of what takes place according to this text. Well, if it is the case that the Egyptian women chose to give of their wealth, and God caused the Egyptian women to give of their wealth, and both necessary accountings of the same event, and both true of the same event, then the two statements are compatible. But to be clear on this, the first statement is one of human freedom expressed by those Egyptian women, and the second statement is one of the determination of God to bring something to pass through these Egyptian women that he predicted he would do. Hence, human freedom of the Egyptian women giving of their wealth and divine determination, God causing them to favor the Israelites, are compatible. So you see that. So on my whiteboard, the second reason is, so God caused the Egyptians to show favor. Right? to show favor. That's clearly what the text says. Put aside any of your presuppositions, put aside any philosophical musings and stuff. It's just simply put that those two things are true in that text. Okay? So do you see that? To account for that historical event, there are two things that are both true at the same time that brought rise to that event. The Egyptians did freely choose to give the Israelites their gold, silver, and clothing. Yet God caused Egypt to show this favor as he said he would to Moses before the event happened. So this would be where the Bible teaches the philosophical idea of compatibilism. Both things are true. They are compatible. And the provisionist perspective panel are incompatibilists. They do not believe it is compatible for a human being to make a free choice, a choice that they desire to make, and God to also determine that choice. They believe that's incompatible. It can't be true. But we want to go by what the Scripture teaches, not what we think or what we sense or what our logic or reason says can and cannot be true. It has to be based on the biblical text. Okay. Next text, Isaiah 10, 5 to 15. Let's pull that one up. Isaiah 10, verse 5. So this text, let's read it. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. But it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. For he says, are not my commanders all kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish, and is Hamath like Arpad? Is not Syria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, so I shall do to Jerusalem. Shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols, as I have done to Samaria and her images? When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look of his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I remove the boundaries of peoples and plunder their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples, as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken. So I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened a mouth or chirped. Shall the axe boast over him who hoes it, or saw magnify itself against him who wields it, as if a rod should wield him who lifts it, as if a staff should lift him who is not wood, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So, let's look at Bruce Ware. It's just Bruce Ware does such a better job explaining this than I ever could. So let's see what he says about this text and the same idea. Okay. So, Bruce Ware says on the book cam here. And let's wait for it to focus here. There we go. Second, God brought punishment upon the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah through the military conquest of foreign nations. He raised up Assyrians against Israel, who took Samaria, its capital city, captive in 722 BC. And he raised up the Babylonians against Judah, who took Jerusalem, its capital city, captive in 586 BC. That it was God who brought about these actions of punishment is clear from innumerable passages, and that free peoples and nations carried out the military campaigns is also clear. God raised them up and used them to accomplish his determined will, yet they did what they most wanted when they pillaged Samaria and Jerusalem respectively. God's determination and human freedom again must be seen as compatible. Excuse me. So, same idea. A historical event, namely these foreign nations invading Israel and taking them off into exile and plundering them, that historical event has two reasons why it happened. God determined it, and yet these nations freely did what they wanted to do. Notice so he quotes the text, and then he continues. Notice two features of this account that are crucial to our understanding of God and his work in the world. One, consider first who the primary actor is who brings destruction on the people of Israel and Judah. Clearly, it is not Assyria who is merely the axe and saw whom God uses to bring about his work. No, the primary actor is God himself, who devises and carries out the destruction of his own people through the instrumentality of the pagan nation of Assyria. that God is the primary actor is stressed in 10:5, where Assyria is the rod of my anger, in 10:6, where God is said to send and command Assyria to do exactly what they do. In 10:12, we'll read of the time when the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, referring to God's work of punishment being completed through the pagan army. And in 10:15, where God is the subject who hews with the axe Assyria and wields the saw Assyria, so that the boasting for what occurs should be attributed to the one who hews and wields, not to the mere instruments he uses. So the text is very clear on that. These nations are the figure we have is they are like an instrument in God's hand. So God is the one wielding the instrument, right? The instrument doesn't wield itself. God is wielding this instrument, right? Number two, so that's the primary reason why this happens. But look at this, number two. Now, second, the responsibility Assyria bears before God for the actions is that they carry out, actions which fulfill the very determined will of God himself. Verse 12 gets to the heart of where we read. When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes. In other words, despite the fact that Assyria was fulfilling exactly what God ordained they do, and despite the fact that they were God's own instrument, his rod, axe, and saw, in carrying out God's determined will of judgment against his people, they nonetheless are held accountable for the arrogance of their heart and their lofty pride that led them to think that their superiority gave them the right to destroy what they viewed as the weak and despicable people of Israel. So this text, because it says it, right? Let's go back to the scripture. It says, when the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look of his eyes. And then it says what his arrogance was. He says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. So they fulfill God's determined will, which is to bring about the destruction of the people and send them in exile. Yet God brings punishment upon them for their free choice in acting in arrogance to plunder these peoples and try to take over the world in an arrogant manner. It's fascinating, right? So here, look what he said. He does the same thing here. So here we have it. God has determined precisely what the Assyrians carry out, and yet God judges the Assyrians for the haughtiness of their hearts in doing what God had determined they do. Right? Here's another case. And I like how he clarifies it. We must notice again the two answers are needed to answer this question. Who brought this devastation upon the people of Israel? Okay, so think about that for a moment. How do you answer the question biblically? Why is it that, how did this destruction be, how was this fulfilled in history? What instrumentality, who fulfilled the destruction of Jerusalem and the carrying off of exile? Who did that? Okay. And two answers are needed, not just one. One answer, the Assyrians did out of the haughtiness of their own heart, is true, right? So you could say, well, why is it that Israel was carried in exile? Well, because the Assyrians, in their desire for conquest and to subdue other nations in their arrogance, they performed the action. And that, of course, is true. But another answer, God did by his determination to use Assyria as his instrument of judgment, also is true. In fact, either answer without the other is incomplete and misrepresents what the passage says really took place. But if both are true, and if both are necessary to give a full account of the destruction of Israel, then it is clear that the two answers together are compatible. The free and responsible actions of the Assyrians, as shown by their arrogant hearts conceiving and carrying out exactly what they most wanted to do, is fully compatible with God's determination to raise up Assyria, commanding and sending them to do exactly what God willed that they do. Divine determinism and human freedom, then, are compatible. So back to our whiteboard, same thing. Same thing, right? What two things are happening here? I'll cross out the Assyrians, right? The Assyrians chose to conquer. They chose to fulfill their desire in conquering, but yet God determined that this would happen using the Assyrians to carry out his will to bring about the exile of the people of Israel, to put his punishment upon them. So that's the biblical data which lays both of those things side by side and states that they are both true. Now, what many times what people will do is they will come to a text like this with a presupposition of incompatibilism. And they will say, well, whatever this text means, we know it can't mean that God can determine something to happen in time and determine creatures make choices, and yet those creatures make those choices freely and responsibly. It can't mean that. So we either have to change how God interacts in time and make it simple foreknowledge, Molinism, open theism, or we go to the other extreme and we are determinists and we say human beings have no genuine free responsibility whatsoever. They're just puppets in God's master plan. The Bible teaches neither one of those. The Bible teaches both. Now, if you want to press human logic and reason and rationality and philosophy onto the text, you can screen out what you want to screen out and find what you want to find. But if you just let the biblical text speak for itself, it seems that it teaches what's called compatibilism. And you don't have to call it compatibilism. Stay away from the philosophical terms. It just teaches that we have the Almighty God, who all things happen according to the counsel of his will. And then we have human beings who are acting freely and responsibly to do what they most want to do. And in doing that, they carry out God's predetermined plan. Seems like both things are true. Now, the next text is Isaiah 44, 28 to 45, and Ezra 1:1. Now, this is an interesting one. So in Isaiah 44, we have the prophecy of Isaiah that, let's see, Isaiah, what was that? Isaiah 44, 28 to 45. We have a prophecy that God gives to Isaiah about the return of the people from exile. Okay, 44:28, right? Well, let's go, because Isaiah has some of the highest language of God's sovereignty and God's plan being carried out on the earth without fail, and God cannot fail to execute his plans. Sing, O heavens, for the Lord has done it. Shout, O depths of the earth. Break forth into singing, O mountains, O forests and every tree in it. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob and will be glorified in Israel. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord, who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by itself, who frustrates the signs of the liars and makes fools of diviners, who turns wise men back and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins, who says to the deep, be dry, I will dry up your rivers. So God's magnificent sovereignty, and the biblical writers never tire of doing this. The prophets, the psalmists, God is the creator, and the power that is on display for everyone to see in God's creation and how he brought that about by his own sovereign will. In the same way that God brought about the creation by his sovereign will, he governs that same creation and the human beings in it by his sovereign will as well, in everything that happens within that creation. And in that context, he says what? Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. Saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before, etc., etc. This is what God's going to do. For the sake of, this is interesting. For the sake of my servant Jacob, Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. And this is an important point. So let's see what Ware says about this. Because then in Ezra, let's look at Ezra 1:1. Ezra, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. So what does God do to bring about the return of the exiles to the land? He stirs up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he makes a proclamation. Very interesting, right? So let's go back to Ware, because he says it better than I ever could. Third, Cyrus, king of the Medo-Persians, issued a decree that enabled the Israelite exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem in 538 BC to begin the process of rebuilding the temple. And of course, God predicted through the prophet Jeremiah that he, God, would be the one who would bring them back to the land. In Jeremiah 24:6, God declared, I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. In Jeremiah 29:10, he promises, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill for you my promise to bring you back to this place. But the human instrument God used to make this happen was Cyrus. Interestingly, though, evidently Cyrus was unaware that he was being used of the Lord to bring about the fulfillment of this promise, even as he issued his decree for the Israelites to return. Isaiah tells us God chose Cyrus as an instrument, so we read that text. Cyrus is described as God's shepherd, God's anointed, who will fulfill all God's own purposes. So God granted to Cyrus military victories, enabling him to ascend to a position of world domination. Yet in all of this, even though Cyrus is blessed by God, anointed by God, and called by God to carry out God's will for his people, Israel, Cyrus doesn't even know this God of Israel, Isaiah 45:4, though you do not know me, whose will he is carrying out. To add to this, when the fulfillment of God's promise commences and Cyrus does issue this decree by which Israel returns to the land, God moves Cyrus to do what he does. The book of Ezra opens with these words. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord, that the word of the Lord might be fulfilled in Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of the king of Persia. We have again here an example of the compatibility of divine determinism and human freedom. God certainly foreknew what he predicted, that Cyrus would proclaim a decree by which the exiled Israelites would return to Jerusalem to rebuild his temple. But clearly, what these passages describe involves more than mere foreknowledge. God works in a multitude of ways to bring to pass exactly what he has determined. He works to name Cyrus, to raise him up as king of a newly ascended nation, Persia. He gives military successes to Cyrus. He moves his heart to assist the Jews in exile, and he stirred him up to write the proclamation he did. These are not matters merely of divine foreknowledge. These are matters of divine determination. And yet, would we want to deny that Cyrus acted freely? Certainly he did what he most wanted as he assembled his military for various campaigns. He did what he most wanted as he made the proclamation for Israel to return. He did what he most wanted when he promised safe passage to the exiles as they made a long and dangerous journey back. That is, Cyrus did exactly what he most wanted to do, while he also carried out what God determined that he do. It appears then that we have a case here of the compatibility of divine determinism and human freedom. So hopefully you're getting the point here. The historical event of Cyrus declaring that the Jews could return from exile back to their land has two explanations for why it happened. God determined it, and think about all the millions upon millions upon millions of choices, human choices that had to be made to put Cyrus in the position of power that he was in and have all the military victories he had. It's mind-boggling. All the human free will choices that had to perfectly align and perfectly be made and happen in just the way they did to bring about this historical event, namely that Cyrus is raised up and he is placed in the position he is, and then he makes the decree to return the people to Jerusalem. And of course, it does clearly say in that text that God stirred his heart to do this. So he repeats himself again in another way, I like how he does this. Notice again that two answers are needed in explaining the return of the Jewish exiles to Jerusalem. Is it adequate to say merely that the Israelites returned because Cyrus proclaimed a decree promising them safety and supplies to travel to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple? So is it a complete biblical answer to say, well, why did the Jews return from exile? Well, because Cyrus made a decree. Well, yeah, that's a true answer, but it's incomplete. Or is it adequate to say merely God brought the exiled people of Israel back from Babylon to Jerusalem through the decree of Cyrus, just as he promised and determined he would do? Each answer is true, but each answer is partial. Each is a necessary part of the full answer, but neither is sufficient in itself. A full accounting of why the exiles of Israel returned from Babylon to their homeland involves both answers. Both are true, and both are necessary elements of the full answer. Hence, both answers are compatible as they together give the full reason for the Israelites' return from exile. But the first answer appears to the free decisions Cyrus made in choosing to send the exiles back to Jerusalem, and the second answer appeals to the determination of God to bring his people back from Babylon 70 years after they were deported, and to do so through the instrumentality of the king of Persia. Well, if both answers are true, and if both answers are necessary for a full accounting of the events recorded in Scripture, and furthermore, if the first answer involves free human agency, while the second involves divine determinism, then it follows that free human agency and divine determinism are compatible. And it's not that God just foreknew that Cyrus would do this. God was intimately involved in bringing about the events and circumstances to make that happen in history. He's not just a passive observer. That's why divine foreknowledge as an explanation of these texts is not sufficient. God is actually active, bringing about what he's determined to happen. God has decided 70 years before, gave a prophecy saying they will return, but then he steps in to influence, move the heart of Cyrus, and actually to make that decree. I mean, this is powerful, compelling stuff to me. This is why I'm a compatibilist, not because I've committed myself to some presuppositional philosophical idea, but because the Bible seems to lay these two truths side by side. God is sovereign. He determines what's happening in time, yet human beings make free, accountable choices, and they do what they most desire and want to do. That's the essence of the philosophical idea of compatibilism. Okay? And then the final text he cites here is Acts 2:23 and 4:27 and 28. And we'll just read them from the book here because we don't have to go back into the accords because they're right here. So this is a very important one. Fourth, consider the words of Peter explaining how it was that Jesus the Christ was put on the cross. So this is a pretty important, like the central importance. And he actually, Ware says it below here, this is the most important event in human history. So what does the Bible say about God's relationship in determining these events and human beings' responsibility for making the choices that bring about these events? What's the relationship between those two things? So the first text he cites is Acts 2:23. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. And then Acts 4:27 and 28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So here's where. We've landed now at the central action carried out in all of human and cosmic history. The death of Christ on the cross is the single most important event to happen in all of the created order. So it seems important that we have a clear understanding from Scripture just how it is that Jesus ended up on that cross. I don't think anyone can disagree with what he just said there about the importance of Christ dying on the cross is the central action in all human and cosmic history, whether you're Calvinist, non-Calvinist, whatever you are. As we can see from the passages quoted, Peter gives us two, not just one answers, both of which are necessary for a full accounting, and only together are they sufficient to explain who put Jesus on the cross. So what's the question? The question is, who put Jesus on the cross? Why was Jesus crucified? What explains what brought about that historical event? One answer to the question of who put Jesus on the cross, of course, is this: wicked people put him there. That they are wicked is explicitly indicated in 2:23 when Peter says Jesus was crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. And it is implied by mentioning Herod, Pilate, Gentiles, and Jews, all of whom said and did various expressions of hatred and evil in giving up Christ to be crucified. But, so that's clearly in the answer that Peter gives, right? It was the wicked men, and it was Pilate, the Jews, the religious leaders, the Gentiles. They all made choices, and their choices brought about the crucifixion of Christ. But another answer is also given by Peter. God put Jesus on the cross according to his long-standing plan and purpose. He did so through the agency of wicked people who plotted and carried out his crucifixion. Both statements by Peter stress that God acted according to his plan he already had in place of putting his son on the cross. But the claim recorded in 4:27-28 says in addition that this plan was carried out precisely through and not apart from the very wicked acts of Herod, Pilate, Gentiles, and Jews. So once again, we see that two answers are needed to account for why Jesus was put on the cross. Wicked men put him there, and God put him there through the plans, words, deeds of those wicked men. Since both answers are true and both are necessary for a full accounting of what took place, it follows that these two answers are compatible. Okay? But what do these two answers involve? The first answer, that wicked people put Jesus on the cross, clearly involves the plans and actions of free moral agents. How could they be charged with being lawless were they not free in what they did? They are held responsible for their choices and actions, hence all they did was done by them freely. But the second answer, that God put Jesus on the cross according to this eternal plan and through the agency of wicked men, involves God's determination of what he would do, a determination carried out precisely through and not apart from free moral agents. So here we have it. The free and responsible actions of the wicked men who schemed and nailed Jesus to the cross, as shown by their jealous and vengeful hearts, conceived in carrying out exactly what they most wanted to do, is fully compatible with God's determination to put his Son on the cross, working through everything to do whatever your hand and plan had predestined to take place. And that's a powerful text that's very hard for an incompatibilist to get around. The events, the choices that were made by these sinful men, they did whatever God's hand and plan predestined to take place. They did to bring to pass exactly what God had willed from eternity that must take place. Divine determination and human freedom then are compatible. And he says there are many more texts. And I want to look at one more text with you. And it's the story of Joseph. And I had that on my whiteboard. Let me go back over to the other one here. Genesis 50:20 and Genesis 45, verse 4. Let's look at Genesis 45, verse 4. And it's the same exact thing. So, if you know the story, of course, Joseph, the beloved of his father with his, coat of many colors, his brothers were jealous of him. And one day, and if you read the story, it's interesting because Joseph is sent to go find his brothers, and they're not actually where they said they were going to be. And just some random guy happens to be there, and Joseph says, "Have you seen my brothers?" And he just happens to know where they are. So God is even inserting some random guy who just happens to be in a position to tell Joseph where his brothers went, or else he would have just turned around and went back home, right? So then he goes and finds his brothers, and because of the jealousy and anger in their heart, they decide to kill him. They're going to kill him. But then instead of killing him, of course, they throw him down into a pit, and then some Egyptian traders go past, and they end up selling him into slavery. And then they take the, animal skin, or they take Joseph's coat, rip it, and put animal blood all over it, and take it back to their father Jacob, and say, Joseph is gone. He must have been torn by a wild animal. So Jacob thinks that his son is dead for all those years. And then fast forward, all the things that God does in his providence to take care of Joseph and provide for him, and ends up exalting him to second in command of Egypt. And then Joseph plays with his brothers. It's a great story to read all the way through if you never have. And then there's a point where Joseph, the brothers don't recognize him as Joseph. They just think he's this ruler in Egypt, second in command of Pharaoh. But then Joseph could not control himself. This is Genesis 45:1. Before all those who stood by him, he cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed in with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So once they realized it was Joseph, they were like, "Oh my goodness. We thought he was dead. We sold him into slavery, and now here he is, and he has all power over our lives." So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Right? So once again, same thing Bruce Ware was saying. So what is the explanation of why Joseph is in Egypt? Well, it's clear. His brothers sold him there. So there's the choice of the brothers doing what they most desired to do, which was, because of their jealousy and hatred of him, sold him as a slave into Egypt. But then look what Joseph says. "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." So once again, why is Joseph in Egypt, and why is he second in command, and why is he in this position he's in? Well, if you just say his brothers sold him there, that would be an incomplete answer. two things have to be stated to have a complete biblical answer. It's not just that his brother sent him there. Oh, wait, what just happened? Sorry, something just messed up. It's not just that his brother sent him there. Joseph says, God sent me before you to preserve life. So the complete biblical answer is the brothers chose to sell him into slavery, and God chose to send Joseph to Egypt through the choices of the brothers. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and the year 5 more years, etc., etc. And then he says, and God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to keep alive for you many survivors. Now look at this verse, 45:8. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. It was not you who sent me here, but God. So when you think about that, well, the brothers made the choices that resulted in Joseph being sent to Egypt. But this text says God sent them to Egypt. So do you see the biblical text is teaching what people call philosophically compatibilism? It is perfectly compatible to say God willed and planned for Joseph to go to Egypt in order to be put in this position to save the Israelites from the famine. Yet, the brothers made a free, rational choice of what they wanted to make in their freedom. They had the freedom to do it. God didn't have a divine gun to their head saying, this is my plan and you will carry it out or else, even if you don't want to. That's not how it happened. Joseph and Joseph's brothers freely chose to do that and to send him into slavery. And then, of course, the other text which goes along with this is Genesis 50:20. You may have heard this text. It's a very important text. So this is after Jacob dies. The brothers are now very concerned that the only thing that kept Joseph from exacting vengeance upon them for what they did to him was that Jacob, their father, was still alive, and Joseph would not want to do anything while the father's still alive. Well, Jacob dies. So when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God to your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. Now, this is also a very important text pastorally, to show someone what the Bible teaches about how we are to deal with and view people who have harmed us and brought harm upon our lives. What should be our ultimate answer to how we are to forgive those who have brought harm upon us? Well, look what it says. Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? So first of all, none of us are in the place of God. Joseph knew it's up to God to bring judgment and retribution upon people, not him. That's God's place. And then 50:20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So in this text is very important. The brothers, in their desires, in their choices, meant evil against Joseph. But God, in his desires and his choices, meant it for good. Now, this is important. I've even seen little wood carvings and little posters and little things you can hang, inspirational things. And you even hear people quote it like this. They quote it as if the text says, you meant evil against me, but God turned it to good, or got good out of it, or made good come about because of it after the fact. That's not what the text says. The text is saying, in the same event, the same choices that happened by the brothers, they meant evil, but God meant what they did for good. God's intention, God's desire, was to plan for that to occur and ordain all the things that led up to it in order to bring about what? What's the result? That many people should be kept alive because Joseph is now in Egypt and has the power to bring the Israelites into Egypt and keep them alive, which is what ends up happening. So there's another example of compatibilism. The explanation for why Joseph is in Egypt is both because God meant it for good and God sent them to Egypt. Joseph says that. He says, God sent me here. Well, did God teleport Joseph to Egypt with an angel? Is that what it meant by God sent him there? No. God ordained the instrumentality of the evil, wicked actions of Joseph's brothers in order to bring about the result he wanted, which was to bring Joseph to Egypt. So there we have it. And then Bruce Ware has more things that we don't have time to go over. It's very good. And then he actually gets into some more stuff. He talks about this isn't just co-agency of mere collaboration, right? And then he talks about he goes over so many objections to this too, and he does a good job going over those. The libertarian free will argument. He talks about the consequent versus, where is that? Yeah, he's got a lot more in here that we don't have time to go over. Maybe we could go over more of this. But my main point in making this short 45 minutes, but this video was to just go over some of these biblical texts, study them again yourself. Let me bring them back up so you can see them. Look at these texts yourself. Exodus 3:21-22, Isaiah 10:5-15, Isaiah 44:28-45, and Ezra, Acts 4:27-28, Genesis 50:20, Genesis 45. Look at these texts. And don't bring any presupposition into it. We all bring presuppositions, but try to screen that out as best you can. And just ask yourself the question, do these texts show that both things are true as an historical event unfolds and takes place? God determined it. God predestined it. God had a plan that he was going to certainly bring about. Yet human beings with free moral agency and responsibility make choices that bring about these events. Both are true. And that's why I say, and it's a mystery, can I reconcile how these two things can be true? No. And what you'll notice is many people will say, well, this is illogical. This is irrational. This makes no sense. You compatibilists, what you're saying is a contradiction. It can't be true that God determined for someone to do exactly what they're going to do and they have no other choice in the matter. They're certainly going to choose what God determined that they choose, yet they're free and morally responsible in the choice they make. That's irrational. That's illogical. Well, I'm just telling you, that's what the Bible teaches. At the end of the day, I don't have to be able to rationalize or logically understand it. I just have to bow to God's revelation. God has revealed it. I need to believe it. I don't need to get into trying to figure it out rationally or logically. And that's what I think is lacking in many people's working through these issues. There's no appeal to mystery. I mean, I've actually heard the provisionist guys mock the appeal to mystery. Well, some Calvinists just say, well, it's a mystery. I don't understand it. Like that's a horrible thing to stop at. Well, I have no problem being there. I have no problem saying that I don't understand how these two things line up, but they do. The Bible just declares them. It puts both side by side in the text and says this is what's going on. God is determining. God is moving people's hearts. God is moving the spirit of Cyrus, yet they make free choices to do what they most want to do. They're making choices that they are held accountable for. Yet God has determined the very choice that they make to bring about his own will and purpose. It's right there. So hopefully if you're struggling with this issue, just ask yourself, as I look at these texts and study these texts, just setting aside any philosophical presupposition, do these texts teach both of these truths? Ask yourself, what does the biblical text give as the explanation for why these historical events took place? And you will see that, and there's many more texts. You will see that the answer is God has determined it, yet human beings make choices. The other one that comes to mind is when Jesus speaks of Judas in the Gospels. He says, the Son of Man must go as it is determined that he go. But woe to him who betrays him. All right, it's another classic. Let's look at one more too, if I can bring it up quickly, if I can find it. One more in the Gospels. I'm going to have to guess. I don't have my Bible in front of me. Matthew, maybe 15. I bet you I won't be able to find it. I'm looking for the text where it says, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you've revealed these things to babes. I don't know. I'm not gonna be able to find. Wait, maybe I can search for it. I wonder if I can search for it. Enter verse, words. Come to me, all. Matthew 11:28. There it is. Okay, let's look at this real quick, and then we'll be done. Matthew 11:28. Oh, geez, it doesn't. I liked Bible Works much better than Accordance, I will tell you. Hang on one second here. All right, Matthew 11. Now, I've always thought this is a powerful text, too, that teaches the, reality of what people call compatibilism. Matthew 11:25. At this time, Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. So very strong language about what God is doing. God is hiding things from the wise and understanding. He's revealing them to little children. And that's whose will? God's will. It's God's will that that's happening. And then look at this, the next verse. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Very strong language, right? How does someone know the Father and the Son? Well, the Son has to choose to reveal them to them. Notice, this is all God's doing, God's actions, God's works. It has nothing to do with human choices at all. So those two verses, very strong, those three verses, 25, 27. But then look at this. Then Jesus says, in the same exact context, I mean, I know there's a chapter division maybe or whatever, but look, come to me then, Jesus says, all who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So right on the heels of this strong view of God is hiding things and revealing things, and only the Son, whoever the Son chooses to reveal, can know the Father and the Son. Then he gives this general offer, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. So all are offered to come, yet only those will come whom the Father and Son have taken this action to reveal to them, and the Son chooses to reveal the Father to them. So why does someone come to the Son? Two answers are required. The Father reveals to them, the Son reveals to them because of God's gracious will, and yet they come. The human element, they come. Both things are true, laid side by side, just like that. Well, we have to get into, well, you can only come because of your libertarian freedom, or it's all about predestination. It's all about what God does, and human beings are just puppets. No, it's both. Both are true at the same time. The Father reveals, the Son reveals, and yet we are invited to come. So I just want to show you that last one. So thank you. I hope this was helpful. Excellent book. I'm not sure if it's still in print. It was by Founders Press. I'm sure you can find it though. Whomever He Wills, a surprising display of sovereign mercy. There's a lot of other excellent articles in here. It's a good book, and it's interesting because it's kind of foundational to the back and forth that we now have with provisionism, because provisionism is a direct descendant of Southern Baptist traditionalism, it's called. So it's interesting this is kind of a historical document too that takes you back into those early debates. Because the other one, which I don't have the other one, I should get it. It's called Whosoever Wills. And I think there was a conference called John 3:16 conference. I'm not sure if that audio is still up that they did early on to state their case on these issues. So thanks for joining me today on Apologetics from the Attic. I appreciate it. And we will take it away here. Thank you, and God bless.